Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Episcopus Admiratio, or a wandering bishop, literally meaning to wander rather than to wonder, as it were. Now, if you've not seen this before, then just let me quickly explain that unlike various other programs that are broadcast through the week with a little more structure, as it were, or purpose, this is really just my excuse to vent my thoughts and share them with somebody else during lockdown. So I may wander and meander about all sorts of things, and so just bear with, as it were. I hope you may find it interesting. You may not, of course. Now, of course, there's a lot that's been going on recently. There's a lot that one could talk about, and as always, the question, the pondering, the wondering is whether or not one should say anything, or whether or not one should express one's views or not. But hang it, sometimes we need to just, as it were, let go. But please understand that anything I say is not deliberately meant to cause offence. If you are offended by anything I say, please understand that it's not a deliberate attempt on my part to be awkward or to be objectionable. It used to be, of course, quite acceptable for people to express and to have and to hold differing opinions without being accused of prejudice or bigotry or bias, unless, of course, such was really the case. And there's often the suggestion, or there used to be the suggestion, that people could agree to disagree. But anyway, we'll see what comes out of my head. But what I did think I would begin with, because and really, I don't know about you, but everything recently has just all gotten a bit too much, has it not? It's bad enough with the lockdown and all the confusion and the chaos around that. You know, whether we're all being hoodwinked or whether it's a very serious situation. There's just, you know, confusion abounds, as it were, as to what it's all about. You know, I find, as you probably know, I attend a lot of meetings in the week around strategizing and planning and coordinating relief efforts. And sometimes, you know, it gets a bit intense when you hear sort of contradictory stuff from the news, etc. One's almost inclined to wonder what it's all about, really. I don't know. It's bizarre times. So as if coronavirus and all of that wasn't hard enough, then of course we've had the whole George Floyd phenomena, all these riots and protests and everything else. And so I thought, just to begin things, just to sort of break the ice, as it were. Oh, now let me say as well that I'm open, of course, as well today to take questions. So if you want to ask me about anything I know about old Romanism or about the faith or whatever, I mean, this is not a sort of formal Ask a Bishop program, but just in case I can't think of anything or I run out of things to say off my own back, then feel free to ask any questions. But yes, anyway, so I thought just to sort of break the ice and just to sort of lighten things up a bit, because things have been, you know, really quite difficult and quite hard for everyone, and social media is not providing quite the relief and escape I think that it once did. And today was no exception. Today, in fact, has sparked a new controversy, although I'm going to treat it sort of lightheartedly, I think you'll understand the severity of this new controversy. So I'm going to play a video by way of introduction.
Hey guys, so I got a lot of questions after my last video, and everyone wanted to see me make hot tea or British tea, so today we are going to make tea. So fill our mug with water, put it in the microwave, set it for a minute, pour the milk in, drop your tea bag in, add the sugar, give it a little stir, and that's how you make hot tea.
Yeah, right. Now, for the benefit of those who won't necessarily perceive the controversy there, for anyone in the UK, what we've just witnessed there is absolute anathema. Absolute anathema. That is not how to make a cup of that is not how to make a cup of tea. And this has caused something of a stir, it has to be said, and quite rightly so. Now, one of the things that was obviously a topic of conversation when I last visited the States, I visited in Chicago. I can't believe I think it's 2 years now, coming up to 2 years ago. And of course, one of the things that the dear friars who were providing hospitality for me were concerned to ensure, and of course, they had the benefit of hindsight. Re my previous visit 2 years before that, they were careful to ensure that there was tea available. Now, Bishop Niklas, who some of you, of course, will be familiar with now, who joins me on Saturdays for Unscripted. He, of course, is from Northern Ireland and knows all about tea, and he went to great lengths to remind me that although the friars had done their level best, nonetheless, it might not be tea as I would know tea. Well, as it happened, the friars, bless them, hadn't done too badly at all, and they had managed to find some Lipton tea. Now, again, in the UK, of course, actually, I was quite surprised the other day to discover that Lipton tea is one of the most popular commercial retail teas in the UK. Now, I reflected about this with a friend, and we could only conclude that that is because it's only Lipton tea that you find in bed and breakfasts and hotels everywhere up and down the country. Because otherwise, as any self-respecting Brit knows, the only proper tea would be stuff like Yorkshire tea or PG Tips or Glengettie tea, or Devonshire tea, Yorkshire tea, and other such. Lipton tea is something that we Brits are familiar with from our travels abroad, and perhaps from the occasional disappointment at breakfast when visiting, when having had to stay overnight at a hotel or something. But Lipton yellow label tea is not generally what we would consider as Brits to be proper tea. Though I have to confess that because of the way I like my tea, I actually don't mind Lipton yellow label myself. But of course, most other people prefer the stronger brands, shall we say. Anyway, so for the benefit of our friends across the pond, who are perhaps not used to drinking tea, or who have never drunk tea in the way that Brits drink tea, let me just go through the video again, and let me just try to explain let me just explain what's wrong with what's going on here. Now, I should, of course, preface this by saying that within Britain, there are variances about the way we brew tea. Not everybody brews tea the same way. Of course, there are many who are not very pro tea bags. There are those who prefer their tea. There are those who prefer to have their tea from a teapot. There are those who are quite happy to use a tea bag and a kettle. And sometimes people appreciate both. It depends sometimes on the practical circumstances one is in. And then, of course, there is the ongoing debate as to how long one should stew the tea. Those who use a teapot, of course, some like to stew the tea for a longer time. The important thing about using a teapot, of course, is that you should warm the teapot first, which amazing how many people don't understand that. But if you're using a china or pottery teapot, it's cold to the touch. So it makes sense to put a little bit of the hot water in it and give it a good swirl and let it warm up a bit before you put in your tea bags, and then more boiling hot water. So, well, anyway, I'm giving things away without without correcting the video. So let's just see if I don't know if I can. Oh, I think I can talk over the top. Let's see.
Hey guys, so I got a lot of questions after my last video, and everyone wanted to see me make hot tea or British tea. So today we are going to make tea. So fill our mug with water, put it in the microwave, set it for a minute.
Yeah, so we never fill the mug from water.
Drop your tea bag in.
No. Not much milk. Never that much milk. And no. How much sugar?
And that's how you make hot tea.
That is not tea. That is hot milk with a tea bag. That is not tea. That is hot milk with a tea bag. And that surely will taste vile. Now, okay, you know, sugar is you know, a personal taste issue. I quite often have just a half spoon of sugar, but not very often. When I was a child, of course, when I was very small, I used to have a lovely little china cup and saucer that was clearly the remnants of what had otherwise been at one time some glorious crockery set. But as a child, I had my own little teacup and saucer, and I remember I used to put something like 4 teaspoons of sugar into that when I was very small. But these days, now and again, I might make maybe a half teaspoon of sugar, perhaps now and again. But anyway, going back to the video, as I was saying before, you never make tea from a hot water tap. Now, of course, in a commercial kitchen where there is a industrial urn, that's a different kettle of fish, because of course the only way to get the water out of an urn is to use the tap. And there have now been introduced in some modern spec domestic kitchens an automatic hot water tap that is independent from the usual sink setup, and is supposed to be hot boiling water whenever you want it. I did have a cup of tea from one of those once. I wasn't too impressed. But the proper way to make tea, as I was explaining before, is really to use a teapot. The key there is to warm the pot first, then put in your tea bag or tea bags, and then your hot water, and then allow it to stew. Now, as I say, there's a difference in taste about the strength of one's tea. I, for example, I prefer a sort of medium brewed tea. Some people like what they call a builder's tea, where it's so stewed that a skin sort of forms, a brown skin sort of forms on top of the tea and sticks to the sides, to the rim of the mug, and the idea being that, you know, a teaspoon would basically stand up in it because it's just so strong. And as I was making reference to before, I mean, read the milk, you see. Now, there's always been a debate over here in the UK about when to add milk. Some people put milk in first, other people put milk in last, by which I mean that some people will put milk into their cup or their mug first, and then pour the hot water over the tea bag in the mug, or pour from the pot into the mug or cup. The trouble is with that, of course, is you can only add more milk. You can't take milk away, which is why some people prefer instead to pour the tea first, and this is generally considered the more correct way, or the more formal way, if not necessarily the right way or the preferred way by some people. But the idea is that you can then alter, or you can alter the strength of the tea with the milk, so that you pour the tea in first, so you've got your brown liquid, and then you pour in the milk to taste or to colour. And of course, that's the other thing. There's a wide variation, read, taste, and colour. It's very personal, very personal. This is the sort of thing that can sort of make or break marriages, as to whether or not spouses learn over time to be able to make tea for their partner correctly. I should say I will have comments on, so if you want to comment, feel free to do so. Especially if you want to argue with me about tea making, then do. I just wanted to check then that we weren't. We are still here. Yes, we are still here. We haven't quite disappeared yet. Yes, indeed. As Christoire says there, honey or sugar. Again, it's considered a little more upmarket, and perhaps better for you to use honey rather than sugar. But I'm sorry. I was digressing. I was getting lost then because of technology. Yeah. Tea, you see, that's I don't know if it's provided any relief for anybody else, but it certainly has me from the other controversies of the day, how to make tea. So anyway, here in the UK, we don't make tea like that. We certainly do not make tea like that. That is not the way to make tea at all. And this is rather surprising. I'm not quite sure where in the US that video was made. I don't know if anybody knows, but certainly that's it can't possibly be from New England, can it? One always has a suspicion that people around Boston and that sort of area are a little more British than American. Well, certainly I think that's the impression they like to give. I'm not sure. Perhaps one of our friends over the pond could speak to that for us. So anyway, that was just to provide a sort of a bit of light relief. I'm assuming that we are still on air. Now, to begin to talk about other things, I don't know if how many of you were able to catch last night's new vocation series Lots of positive responses to that, has to be said, including by prospective candidates. So that's good to know. One of the questions that people have is regarding, they want to know more about, what is Old Romanism? What is the difference between Old Romanism and Roman Catholicism? Which I'm always very tempted to go into, but I won't go into now, because I did say to one of the commentators last night that is something that we will talk about within the series. But perhaps again, slightly continuing with the slightly lighter theme of this program, perhaps I should explain the joke, the title of this series. As you know, it's Episcopus Admiratio. Episcopus Admiratio, which translated means wandering bishop, wondering, wandering as in to think. But it is, of course, a joke. It's a play on another Latin term, Episcopus vagans, or the plural Episcopi vaganti, which also translates as wandering bishop, but translates as wandering, wandering, as in to dither about, or to move about. Now, I say it's a deliberately, this is a deliberate joke, in the sense that, well, in various different ways and different senses, really. In one sense, because, well, I suppose, let me explain what an Episcopus vagans is. So an Episcopus vagans, a wandering bishop, means a bishop who has been, is a bishop with no connection or proper connection to any historic see. It's a term that really derived from sort of around the 4th, 5th centuries, as a canonical term, to refer particularly to those bishops who had left their appointed see, and thought it was okay to sort of leave their post and go off somewhere else. It also became a term to refer to bishops who had been deposed, bishops who had been perhaps sent into exile, perhaps who were deposed for heresy or apostasy. Though remember, of course, sometimes bishops, very orthodox bishops, were sometimes sent into exile. So essentially it means somebody who has been ordained or consecrated a bishop, but without, as it were, a see, without a home, without an office, I suppose one could say. So the problem was, of course, back in the day, so back in the 4th, 5th centuries, the problem was that often these wandering bishops, these Episcopus vagans, or these Episcopi vaganti, rather, caused problems, because they would wander through somebody's diocese, and they would stop off at churches, and of course, because they were a bishop, people would show them deference and hospitality without necessarily realizing that this bishop, in fact, had been excommunicated or deposed, or whatever. So that we read in various councils of the time, canons, rules, dictating how such bishops were to be treated. Generally, of course, they were to be avoided, and for obvious reasons. Then, in recent times, say, for example, in the past 100 years or so, the Episcopi vaganti phenomena has arisen again. In large part now, however, these are bishops consecrated by bishops who themselves never were attached, as it were, to one of the historical, formal, canonical jurisdictions. And again, this can happen for all sorts of reasons. You may have a bishop who was consecrated originally as a regular bishop in a regular situation, but who, for a variety of reasons, left his office and left that jurisdiction, and then has subsequently consecrated other men as bishops, but in likewise fashion, of course, in an irregular way. That is to say that, without proper jurisdiction or perhaps purpose. Some of you may know, for example, that my own title is titular Archbishop of Selsey. Now, titular means it became used as a reason to consecrate bishops, extra bishops, than the usual diocesan bishops. So, for example, you will be familiar with the concept of subs or auxiliary bishops. So within a diocese, you will have the diocesan bishop, but he may be assisted by 1, 2, or 3 assistant bishops. And in order for them not to incur, as it were, the irregular character of not being consecrated for a particular post, for a particular see, the tradition arose of consecrating them to titular sees. Titular sees, generally speaking, refer to dioceses or to city sees that for one reason or another no longer exist. Whether that's historical, for example, with regard to my own see, the See of Selsey was the original see that St. Wilfrid of York founded here in Sussex when he converted the last of the Saxon kingdoms to be converted down here in the south of England. His original see, where he set up, as it were, his centre as bishop for his diocese, was at Selsey. But later, in the Norman period, there was a restructuring, and the see was sort of dissolved, became a part of a larger see of Winchester, and later again in the medieval period a new see was created at Chichester. So historically then, the See of Selsey, as it were, no longer exists, and that's why my title is titular, meaning to refer to that historic see. Does this all make sense? Are you following? Just give a thumbs up. Or if you want a qualifying question, then please just ask. Titular sees also, of course, sometimes they refer to dioceses or city sees that have been lost. So, for example, in the later medieval period, with the rise of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, various historic sees, dioceses, and bishop seats, of course, became untenable because of the Muslims. So therefore, those churches, those dioceses, disappeared. So again, then when auxiliary or assistant bishops were consecrated in the West, for example, then often they would take a titular see. In other words, they would take one of the sees that of the historic churches that have now been lost because of the growth of the Ottoman Empire, etc. So that's where the whole thing about a titular see comes from. And that's all because some of the most ancient canons concerning the consecration of bishops in order to, establish order in the church, suggested that, not suggested, but ruled that nobody should be consecrated a bishop without a title. In other words, without a see, without belonging to somewhere. Similar canons, of course, for the other clergy as well. Strictly speaking, of course, unless they are religious, unless they are incarnated into a religious order, men for the diaconate and for the priesthood should properly be ordained to a title, usually a curacy, for example, so that when they are presented to the bishop for ordination, the bishop is informed as to what church they are going to be ordained to serve, and that, of course, is reflected in the ordination letters, or the ordination certificate. But certificatory letters of the bishop will say that I ordained so and so on this day for the title of, in other words, for the church of where he would serve. And that's, of course, and this was all, of course, to, have, well, for decency and order, and to prevent, of course, people just willy-nilly walking around claiming to be this or that. Now, in the last 100 years or so, as I say, because various regular bishops became irregular, either through resignation or retirement or excommunication or deposition, etc., they would then ordain priests or other bishops. Now, of course, the theology of the Sacrament of Orders is that it only requires one bishop to consecrate another bishop. It only requires one bishop to ordain one or several priests. Now, some of you, of course, will say, but aren't you supposed to have 3 bishops to consecrate a new bishop? Well, actually, the custom or the tradition certainly was developed that at least 2 or 3 bishops should co-consecrate together a new bishop, but that's not for the sacramentality. That really was as an expression of the regular status of the new bishop. Regular meaning, of course, legal, and meaning recognized, so that the other bishops would represent, as it were, the other churches. This comes from the concept of the bishop being the head of a particular church, and thus, when a new bishop is consecrated, you need one bishop who is the prime consecrator, and then you need another bishop or 2 bishops, can be more, who act as witnesses to the consecration. Now, there's an ongoing debate, actually, as to whether or not they literally co-consecrate or whether or not they just testify, whether or not they are just witnesses. And that's why sometimes some people think it is a question of validity. But essentially, it arose really as the tradition, the custom arose really as an expression of communion. In other words, the other bishops from other local churches are saying, we are here and we are recognizing and we testify, and we will testify and uphold this new bishop of this particular church as the bishop, etc. But really, in terms of sacramental validity, you only need one bishop to make another bishop. Now, this is then, of course, you can see why this has created problems in recent years with irregular bishops going around consecrating other irregular bishops. And it's a problem, a phenomena that crosses east and west, and part of the problem is perhaps that in the West, in the Latin tradition, it is generally thought, and it is generally taught and believed, of course, that it only takes one bishop to make another bishop. Therefore, that bishop is a bishop. In the East, amongst our Orthodox brethren, for them, the matter of communion is more important than necessarily the sacrament. Of course, the sacramental validity is relevant, but in order for most Orthodox bishops to recognize a bishop, there needs to be a communion extant. So in other words, that they recognize and know each other, and are in communion with each other. In the West, the theology of sacraments is slightly different, as I say, in the sense that it's the sacramental validity, as it were, that seems to take precedence, so that it matters more that the consecrating bishop was and is a valid bishop, as to whether or not the person he has consecrated is actually a bishop. And there are also, there are all sorts of this is a complex canonical situation. I just suddenly realised actually how what was really a joke, or meant as a joke, of course, has quite a serious side or aspect to it all, because there are, of course, now people today walking around claiming to be and who call themselves bishops, who may or may not have validity, and more important to most people is whether or not they have communion. Now, one of the things about Old Romanism, for example, is, of course, now this is the other thing, that again, really in the last 100 years, and particularly in more recent times, where progressive attitudes and theologies and ideologies have infected churches and jurisdictions. The issue today is, I mean, for example, of Anglicans. Some of you, of course, will know that there is the what's called the mainstream Anglican Communion, with the Archbishop of Canterbury at its head, and then the various Anglican and Episcopal churches around the world. But of course, in recent years, there have been significant schisms among those churches over the ordination of women, or over or over same-sex marriages, etc. And so you have the mainstream Anglicanism, and then you have what's called continuing Anglicanism. This is where bishops and priests and faithful of an Orthodox position have distanced themselves, or literally taken themselves out of visible communion with the rest of the mainstream Anglican communion. So that in terms of the question of regularity, in terms of canonical status, those who are in the Anglican mainstream would generally refer to those in the continuing church as being irregular, as being part of a schism, as being out of the main communion, and therefore irregular. And so, and then technically vaganti. Whereas from the continuing perspective, So the continuing Anglican perspective would of course put that the other way around, and would accuse the mainstream of irregularity in the sense of condoning or holding to beliefs and practices contrary to tradition, or contrary to the historic tradition, and contrary even to orthodox doctrine. So that today it's really quite interesting, because it's difficult today really to say in those sort of situations, well, who is regular and who is irregular? Who is regular and who is irregular? And then it begs the question, what is canonical regularity? So of course those who are in the mainstream would say, oh well, because we hold still all the buildings, because we still hold all the chattel, as it were, that makes us the regular, and because we're still operating under the original titles, as it were, they would say, well, that makes us the regular. But of course, those in the continuing situation would say, well, no, you've effectively, because of your heresy or your apostasy, you've effectively nullified your canonical regular status, because how can a heretic or an apostate hold a canonical office? This same debate and discussion goes on in Catholic circles too. So that, for example, Sedevacantists, there are traditional Roman Catholics who believe that the heresy of the present popes since Vatican II negates the canonical regularity of those incumbents, because they hold to various theses that say that somebody who is a heretic or an apostate automatically nullifies whatever ecclesiastical position or office they hold. So in the case of the Pope, from a Sedevacantist point of view, they would say, well, the Pope is in error, the Pope is a heretic, the Pope is an apostate, therefore he isn't Pope. Then there are variations on that. So the Sedeprivationists, for example, who would say, well, immaterially, he is the Pope, in the sense that the conclave, the official conclave, elected him and successors, and in a material sense, because he has possession of the Vatican, he has control of the Curia, etc. They would say, so he is materially Pope, but then they would say, but he's not formally Pope, in the sense that because of his heresy, because of his error, he cannot be said to legitimately exercise the papal power. Then you have other Catholics, again, traditional Catholics, who will say, well, no, he is Pope. In every which way, he is Pope, but because he teaches or condones errors and heresies, we don't feel obliged to immediately obey him. This would be, for example, the Society of St. Pius X, which is a strange situation. The problem for all of these is that if you hold to the dogma of the First Vatican Council, Pastor Aeternus, which defines papal infallibility and universal jurisdiction of the Pope, there isn't an option in that ever to reject the Pope, or to reject his authority. That if you hold to the dogma. Now, of course, the old Roman situation is, of course, that we ourselves never formally went into schism, So when Pius IX instituted a new hierarchy in Holland, which is where the old Roman Catholic Church ultimately comes from, it's derived from that situation in the early 19th century, there was an extant canonical dispute going on between the See of Utrecht and the See of Rome. And this was concerning previous popes who were granted particular privileges to the See of Utrecht, one of which notably was that the cathedral chapter, or the diocesan chapter, the collegiate chapter of the See, had the right in perpetuity, meaning forever, to elect its own bishops. And a situation arose, basically, where the Ultramontane party in Rome, so from the really post-Trent onwards, obviously it sort of existed before, but there was this gradual growing desire to centralize power in Rome. And so there arose this dispute between Utrecht and Rome about the appointment of bishops, and this was never really concluded. Of course, what was interesting was the great canonical faculties and theologians at the time actually sided with Utrecht. And said, well, in perpetuity means in perpetuity. And if that's what a previous Bishop of Rome said, then surely that holds. And surely that binds his successors. But then there were certain of his successors or their advisors who said, no, why should a bishop of Rome be bound by the administrative decisions of his predecessors, etc. So a complicated situation, but was never really resolved. And then eventually in the middle of the 19th century, Pius IX, rather than resolve that situation, simply instituted a new hierarchy in Holland, did a deal with the government, kind of behind the original sees back, as it were, and did a deal and institute a new hierarchy. So then essentially you had in Holland then two Catholic hierarchies. You had what became known as the old hierarchy, which was the historic see that had previously existed and had the cathedral and churches, etc. And then you had this new hierarchy instituted by Pius IX. And the Pope essentially chose to, as it were, withdraw recognition of the old see in preference for his new hierarchy. So the interesting thing there, of course, is that old Romans were never then there was no schism, in the sense that the old Roman hierarchy, did nothing schismatic. Arguably, the person who instituted a schism or brought about a schism was Pius IX. So, of course, then going forward, in 1870, the First Vatican Council. Now, interestingly, the bishops, the old bishops in Holland, wrote to the Vatican and said, "Where are our tickets? where are our invitations?" And they were just ignored. Then, of course, papal infallibility was promulged by the First Vatican Council. And that's a fascinating thing that we'll go into perhaps another time. Read the voting, read the discussions, etc. But the point of all that is that, of course, after that, so what effectively Vatican I did was to promulge this new dogma. Now, the difference between a dogma and a doctrine is that a doctrine is a teaching. A dogma is something that you are required to believe in for salvation. Now, the old Roman position, of course, was, well, hold on a minute. You created a new dogma in 1854 without an ecumenical council, i.e. the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And and then subsequently, we created another new dogma for papal infallibility. Historically, in both instances, these were, well, papal infallibility of all things was new, really. Well, there was a new concept. Interestingly, the Catholic bishops of England and Ireland at the beginning of the 19th century, in the build-up to Catholic emancipation, remember that here in Britain, in the UK, Catholics were forbidden by law to hold, for example, public office and other things because of the whole Reformation thing and the Elizabethan Act of Settlement. And Catholic emancipation, which was a gradual thing, but of course meant, the idea of it was to allow Catholic citizens in the UK once again to be able to play a part in public life and hold public office, etc. And in the build-up to that, one of the questions that Parliament wanted answered of the Catholic bishops was about their relationship with the Pope and their relationship with the Bishop of Rome. What Parliament essentially wanted to know was whether British bishops considered themselves first and foremost citizens of Britain, or were their loyalties divided, and were they really citizens of the Vatican? That's kind of where Parliament was coming from. So in order to assuage any fears, Irish and Catholic, Irish and English bishops were very keen to point out that they were first and foremost British citizens. Absolutely, those who were natural citizens were of course British citizens, and of course loyal subjects to the crown. And the notion that their loyalties in that respect were divided was a slur. To which then Parliament asked the question about papal infallibility, to which the Irish and English Catholic bishops wrote and said, "Oh no! The idea, the very notion of papal infallibility is a Protestant slur on the Catholic religion. A Protestant slur on the Catholic religion." In other words, these Catholic bishops were saying that the concept, the notion of papal infallibility, was a fabrication by Protestants to make us look bad. Only 40, 50 years later, papal infallibility becomes a dogma of the Catholic Church. So there's, as you can see, there's some discrepancy there, some issue in continuity of belief. And essentially for old Romans, this is what everything boils down to, is continuity of belief. And so the old Roman position generally, and the old Roman position with regard to, for example, these what are known as the papal dogmas from the 19th century, is that for old Romans, we hold to the old Roman faith as it ever was before the introduction of these new dogmas. Now, bearing in mind that the whole principle, the whole argument previously for Catholic tradition was, the Catholic faith is that, as St. Vincent of Lerins said, the Catholic faith is that which has always been believed everywhere and by all. That is how you recognize the Catholic faith. And he was writing that at a time of heresies, controversies, back in the 7th century. So that is, became, as it were, a rule of thumb, and still is, of course. As an old Roman, I would say that. Still is, that the Catholic faith is that which has always been believed everywhere and by all. And essentially that means that then the introduction of new dogmas, almost 2,000 years after the time of the Apostles, just doesn't seem logical, doesn't seem orthodox. Now, bearing in mind, of course, there are other areas, other doctrines where some divergence between East and West had occurred, leading up to and after the Great Schism in 1054. So this has always been, an area of debate and controversy. But from the old Roman perspective, particularly, the introduction of these two new dogmas so late in the day, as it were, in the 19th century, and arguably fashioned contrary to the way in which normally dogmas would be in previous times had been developed and recognized. This is a problem. So that's why the old Roman position concerning, for example, the Pope is different again from those other traditional Roman Catholic perspectives. I think perhaps next time I will talk more about the differences between old Romans and traditional Roman Catholics, because there is certainly some confusion there in the minds of some people, and certainly, for example, it has sometimes caused problems. Indeed, in many ways, it still is causing problems among old Romans, particularly when former Roman Catholics become old Romans, because they recognise, of course, the tradition that we keep and maintain, really the old Mass and the old devotional ways, the old spiritual practices, etc. But they come, as it were, with their novel dogma baggage, and that has caused and can cause problems. So maybe I'll talk about that next time. Now, let me just finish by saying, of course, repeating the caveat that I gave at the beginning, and that I made clear about this series from the off. This is not formal. This is this is not ex cathedra. This is not formal or official teaching. This is me wandering aloud. I could certainly argue for everything that I've said, but but please understand that in this capacity, in this forum, as it were, I'm not here as speaking officially. I'm simply sharing my thoughts. But anyway, there we go. That may help to explain for some of you my thinking, so that you understand where I am coming from in other situations in which these topics may come up. Anyway, there we go. So that was my hour of release. So bless you. Thank you for watching. Hope that was interesting, and I hope that doesn't put you off coming back and listening to me again another time. Otherwise, of course, tomorrow official programs resume, so that 6 o'clock tomorrow, 6 o'clock will be Holy Hour, broadcast from the Oratory Chapel here in Brighton with benediction, and then at 9 o'clock tomorrow, 9 p.m. BST, British Summer Time, or GMT, Greenwich Mean Time +1, will be late night catechism, which is the opportunity to for you or anyone to have answers to sometimes awkward or embarrassing questions that are necessary to ask and be answered and to be understood in terms of applying oneself to the traditional Catholic faith and spirituality in the 21st century. So that's late night catechism, 9 o'clock tomorrow. Then the rest of the week, 6:15 as usual, following the Angelus at 6 o'clock. Friday night live this week. There is a poll. If you visit the Old Roman Facebook page, so facebook.com/The Old Roman, all one word, that will take you to the Old Roman page. If you scroll down the news feed there, you will find there is a poll for this week's Friday night live as to whether you would like a review on 2 films, either The Shoes of the Fisherman, starring Anthony Quinn as an Eastern European Pope, or the other choice is The Mission, featuring Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, and set of course in the 16th century South America. So those are the 2 options. So look out for that. Quite a few people have voted already. I can tell you now that at the moment, the last time I looked, it was swinging towards The Shoes of the Fisherman. So if some of you don't want it to be Shoes of the Fisherman, but want it to be The Mission, you perhaps need to do some campaigning and get some more people to visit the Old Roman and vote in the poll. Okay. So again, bless you all for watching. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope to see you online in these other programs. So take care and God bless.